One more time, Professor Norman Finkelstein.
Thank you for having me here this evening. And I'm going to try to do two things. First, go through what happened in Gaza this past summer, then make some comments about the relationship between Gaza and Egypt. And there are important comparisons worthy of taking note. And then during the questions and answers, I hope we can devote time to both the question of Egypt and a topic which I think is more urgent than ever. I think it's a little bit too loud, the volume, whoever is controlling it. Just a little bit lower, if you don't mind, because I can hear the echo. Okay. To talking about both Egypt and also in the question of Israel and Palestine, the practical question, the question of a strategy, what to do, how to proceed, because judging by the news accounts these past couple of days, I think things are rapidly unraveling. I can't say I'm very optimistic about where they're headed right now, but there's always things to do and trying to figure out what we should be doing. And I look forward to hearing from you, even the vehement dissents from statements I've made in the past couple of years. First of all, what did happen in Gaza? In fact, there were some novelties in the last Israeli assault on Gaza. Operation Protective Edge, which began July 8th, ended about August 26th, lasted about 51 days. But on the whole, it was not unlike the previous operations, the previous massacres. I prefer the non-antiseptic term, massacres. It was not unlike the previous ones, though it was on clearly a larger scale. During during Operation Cast Lead, about 1,400 Palestinians were killed. About 1,200 were civilians. During Operation Pillar of Defense, the figures were significantly lower. About 200 Palestinians were killed, about 80 of them civilians, and on a much larger scale now. In the case of Protective Edge during July and August, there was about 2,200 Palestinians killed, about 1,500 of them civilians, about 520 of them children. But in general, I don't think it was very much unlike what preceded it. The important point to begin with is the precipitant. What caused Israel to launch the latest massacre in Gaza? The facts, I think, are fairly clear, though unlike in the previous massacres, they're not quite as unambiguous. There is an element of ambiguity, and I have to grant it. But the end of April 2014, a national, what was called a government of reconciliation, national reconciliation was formed between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Surprisingly, the United States and the European Union did not break off relations with the new government, but basically took an approach of let's just see what's going to happen. Also surprisingly, Hamas accepted the terms of the Palestinian Authority for negotiations, namely recognizing Israel, ending violence, and respecting past agreements. So Hamas was now behaving in a fashion which caused Israel great grief, because Hamas was not carrying on like a terrorist organization, which is what Israel wants. Israel does everything it can to provoke Hamas violent assaults so that it can justify preserving the occupation. And now they had a big problem on their hands. Hamas was carrying on in a too moderate fashion. And then they had a second problem on their hands, namely the US and the EU were not breaking off relations. Mr. Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, was manifestly enraged. He said, Hamas is a terrorist organization, how can you be negotiating with it? And this was the second slight by the US and the EU. The first slight was negotiating with Iran, even though Israel and Mr. Netanyahu was saying Iran was threatening Israel with a second Holocaust, but the US and the EU continued negotiations with Iran, and now adding insult to injury, they were continuing with negotiations with a government that included Hamas, according to them, a terrorist organization. So Netanyahu both raged and was in a panic, and then he used a gift that dropped into his lap, namely the abduction of the three Israeli youths, the abduction of them. He used that as a pretext to carry on a rampage in the West Bank. There's some facts about what happened to the three youths that are still not clear, but two facts seem pretty clear. Fact number one, the Hamas leadership did not approve the operation, though it was a local Hamas cell that carried it out. And fact number two, Netanyahu almost certainly knew from the get-go that the three youths were killed almost immediately. Nonetheless, he pretended that he was carrying out a search operation and then conducted what he called Operation Brother's Keeper and went on a rampage, as I said, in the West Bank, killed about 6 Palestinians, arrested about 700 Palestinians, overwhelmingly Hamas members, detonated a couple of homes, ransacked businesses, and so forth. And the reason was perfectly obvious, namely Netanyahu was desperate to try to evoke a violent reaction from Hamas, and then the violent reaction could be used by him to say, you see, I told you, they're terrorists, how could you negotiate with them? Or as he said later to a US official, never second guess me again when it comes to Hamas. Namely, I told you they're terrorists, now you see they're terrorists, I was right to begin with. At the beginning, Hamas resisted the provocations, but other armed groups in Gaza did not resist the provocations, and then it quickly spiraled out of control, and the new assault began. The assault began not with a ground invasion, it was an aerial attack. Netanyahu held back on the ground invasion, basically because he knew a ground invasion, if you obey the rules of law, a ground invasion would mean a large number of combatant casualties, and Israeli domestic society does not accept a large number of combatant casualties. It's a Spartan-like society or a Sparta-like society, and combatant casualties are actually more resisted by domestic society than civilian casualties. On the other hand, if you went into Gaza and you just blasted away, as they did in Operation Cast Lead, he was fearful of the international reaction, keeping in mind what happened after Cast Lead, namely the Goldstone Report and so forth. So he held back on the ground invasion until about 2 weeks into the beginning of the assault, which, as I said, began around July 7th. About 2 weeks into it, 2 new gifts dropped into his lap. The first one was a rigged ceasefire proposal that was presented by the Sisi. I know I'm supposed to call him president, but I find it hard to do so. So we'll just call him Sisi. He presented a ceasefire proposal. It was probably concocted by Tony Blair, but we'll leave that aside for a moment. Sisi presented a proposal, and the proposal said that we're not lifting one of the stipulations of the proposal was that the blockade of Gaza would not be lifted until the security situation stabilizes on the ground. Now, in all the prior ceasefire agreements, the one in June 2008 and then the one in November 2012, in all the prior ceasefire agreements, that condition never existed for a perfectly obvious reason. Israel says Hamas is a terrorist organization. So by definition, the security situation on the ground cannot stabilize until and unless Hamas is either disarmed or defeated, or either disarms itself or is defeated. So the Israelis and the British, Tony Blair, and the Egyptians knew perfectly well that Hamas had to reject that ceasefire proposal because it meant that the blockade of Gaza would never be lifted. And then Israel used it as a pretext. It said, you see, we accepted the ceasefire proposal, Hamas rejected it, Hamas keeps firing projectiles at us, they called them rockets, kept firing rockets at us, and what were we to do? And then the second gift that dropped into Israel's lap, or Netanyahu's lap, was the downing of the Malaysian airliner over the Ukraine, which immediately shifted all the headlines to Malaysian airliner. And whether we like it or not, politics is not always about the big picture and abstract forces. Politics is often about what happens day to day and minute to minute. And a good politician knows how to exploit those moments. And Netanyahu is a good politician. And he knew this was an opportunity. The cameras were now off Gaza, so he could go in, blast away, and probably get relatively little criticism. And so he launched the ground invasion. The ground invasion was not unlike what Israel has done in the past. Already before the ground invasion, in fact, I was reading Amnesty International's report that came out yesterday on Israel's attacks on civilian residences during the Gaza attack. And they made the point that already on July 8th, the very first day, before the ground invasion, long before the ground invasion, already on the very first day, Israel was attacking civilian residences in Gaza, which Amnesty International, in the report that came out, as I said yesterday, it's about 50 pages, and it says these constitute, what Israel did constituted war crimes. For those of you who had a chance to read the report, it's quite interesting that actually Amnesty bent over backward to give Israel any credibility to Israeli claims. But even if you make the maximum case for Israel, it still came out to be war crimes. Well, they targeted civilian residences, they targeted businesses, schools, mosques, hospitals, ambulances, power stations, sewage plants, civilian shelters, citizens fleeing the scenes of combat. They did as they always do. They claimed that when they started to come under attack in the media for their precision terror attacks, they claimed that Hamas was using human shields, using Palestinians as human shields. And as in the past, all the credible human rights organizations and journalists found no evidence that Hamas was using Palestinians as human shields. The purpose of the attack was perfectly obvious, namely you target the civilians enough, you hope that you're going to break their will and either get them to turn against Hamas either during the war or turn against Hamas afterwards when the people look around and see the magnitude of the destruction. As I said, by the end, about 2,200 Palestinians were killed, about $6 billion. The head of the International Committee said, I've never seen such massive destruction ever before. deaths and destruction in Gaza has shocked and shamed the world. The world's leading authority in Gaza's economy is still Concordia University. She said in the decades that have been involved with Gaza and her people, I have never seen the kind of physical and psychological destruction that I see here today. The wounds of this war could prove too severe to heal. Well, what happened in Gaza, some of it turned out to be more pleasant for Netanyahu than he anticipated, and then some of it turned out to be not as pleasant as he would hope. The U.S., not surprisingly, gave Israel blanket support, carte blanche to proceed. Almost it became a kind of mantra of the U.S. administration, either Mr. Obama or some member of the State Department. Each day came out and asked about Israel's targeting of civilians, targeting of civilian objects, hospitals, schools, and so forth. Every time they repeat the same statement, Israel has the right to defend itself. The fact of the matter is, Mr. Obama was the enabler-in-chief of the latest massacre in Gaza. You might say he didn't have much choice because Congress was 100% behind Israel. There's an argument to be made there, but it seems to me, even if you say, you can make the claim that politically he didn't have much choice, he did have the choice of not having each day to keep repeating in the face of all the evidence. Because by midway through, the human rights organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they were denouncing Israel's war crimes in Gaza. He didn't have to keep repeating every day, Israel has the right to defend itself. That was a choice he made. The international support for Israel was higher than usual. Egypt and Saudi Arabia gave blanket support to Israel. The Arab League gave blanket support to Israel. It only met once, and the only time it met was to give support for the phony, the rigged ceasefire proposal of Sisi. Most of the rest of the Arab world was preoccupied with its own travails, whether it be Syria, Iraq, Libya. So there was very little in the way of popular support, except for some demonstrations in Jordan. The only place which redeemed itself during the latest massacre was, oddly enough, it was Latin America. Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, El Salvador, Chile, Peru, Uruguay, Venezuela. They all gave very strong support to the people of Gaza. They had nothing to gain from it. There was no self-interest. It was a really impressive display of human solidarity. Unfortunately, none of the Palestinian leaderships took advantage of it and still haven't taken advantage of it. Israel was surprised by what it calls the terror tunnels. They were quite sophisticated. Arabs, as most of you know, they major in civil engineering. When you have a lot of unemployed civil engineers, as there are in Gaza, they can be quite ingenious and clever. And it really was a wondrous feat of civil engineering, the tunnels that they constructed. And so they became a more effective fighting force, mostly, I think, because of the tunnels, though also apparently because of more training. During Operation Cast Lead, 10 Israeli soldiers were killed, and 4 of the 10 were killed due to friendly fire, and the Israelis accidentally killing other Israelis. During the last battle, 66 Israeli soldiers were killed. So they had become a more effective fighting force. And the Israeli troops were reluctant to enter Gaza further. They never really went past the border. The furthest they got into Gaza was about 1 to 2 miles because of the fear of these tunnels. On the other hand, the claims Israel made about the tunnels in many respects are completely false. Of the 32 tunnels that Israel detonated, only 20 of them actually went, only 12 of them actually went into Israel. What Israel was worried about was not the tunnels that were crossing the border into Israel. What Israel was worried about was the tunnels inside Gaza, because the tunnels now had enabled the resistance to be more effective. And so they wanted to destroy the tunnels inside Gaza. They obviously had options to destroy the tunnels that were entering Israel. First of all, let's bear in mind there were 12. Secondly, there's a lot to say about what what Sisi's now doing in Egypt, and I'll come to that later. But let's keep in mind one fact. I'm not trying to defend Sisi. I'm just trying to look at the facts. He says there's a major problem with terror tunnels from Gaza into the Sinai. And he's building this moat, effectively a moat on the border. But he didn't enter Gaza to destroy the tunnels. It was obviously an option by Israel if in fact they wanted to destroy the tunnels entering Israel. They obviously had exactly the same option as Sisi's now exercising. You build a moat on your side of the border. So all the claims that Israel was making, all the claims it was making, that it had to enter Gaza, destroy $6 billion in infrastructure, kill 2,200 people, murder 500 children because of the terror tunnels. You could simply have done what Sisi's doing right now. Build a moat on your side of the border. But the fact of the matter is, it was never about the tunnels entering Israel. It was about the tunnels inside Gaza, which made it more difficult for Israel to do what it likes to do periodically, namely go into Gaza and mow the lawn. This time, so to speak, the lawn was fighting back, and that was a problem. The second claim about Israel made was about these terror rockets. The rockets, in fact, that was all science fiction. It would take me too long to go through the record now. Israel claims 4,000 rockets were fired into Israel. Of the 4,000 rockets that fired into Israel, they say there were only 7 civilians killed and about $15 million in property damage. So that's a little odd. 4,000 rockets with only 7 civilians killed and $15 million in property damage, which is probably about the equivalent of 5 homes were destroyed. So how do you explain the discrepancy? Well, Israel explains it by saying Iron Dome, this miracle of Iron Dome, their anti-missile defense system. That's highly implausible for the following reasons. One, it just requires some simple math. I know that a lot of people nowadays are digit challenged, but I'll try to make it as simple as possible. So during Operation Cast Lead in 2008-9, there was no Iron Dome. Their figure is 1,000 rockets were fired into Israel with no Iron Dome, and 3 civilians were killed. Now 4,000 rockets were fired into Israel, and 7 civilians were killed with Iron Dome. If you do the math, it would have been without Iron Dome, based on Operation Cast Lead. It would have been 1,003 civilians, so 4,000 rockets would have been how many civilians killed? 12. Nicely done. And in fact, 7 were killed, so Iron Dome accounts for, at most, maximum, accounts for 5 civilians not being killed. But that's not even true, because Israel massively upgraded its civil defense system since Protective Edge 2008-9. So the 5 other civilians who would have been killed without Iron Dome, the fact that they weren't killed can easily be explained by the upgraded civil defense system. That's all a complicated way of saying Iron Dome didn't save anybody. In fact, one of the world's leading experts in anti-missile defense, his name is Theodore Postel at Harvard University, excuse me, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Postel said, at most, Iron Dome had an effectiveness of 10%. So there were 3,900 rockets fired. That means 3,500 were not deflected by Iron Dome. 3,500 rockets were not deflected by Iron Dome. So then how do you account for so few casualties, so little damage to the infrastructure? Postel says probably because of the civil defense system, the upgrade of the civil defense system. But I don't think that's a totally credible explanation because, okay, people can jump into bunkers, but houses don't go into bunkers. Hospitals don't go. So how do you explain it? It's quite simple. There were no rockets. There were just firecrackers and Roman candles. There were upgraded fireworks that Israel was firing, that Hamas was firing at Israel. How did it end? Basically, the ending is quite revealing for what I want to talk about during questions and answers, so I'm just going to get to it quickly. How the murder and the mayhem, the rampaging, ransacking, and killing, how did it finally come to an end? What happened was Israel attacked one UN shelter, UN school shelter, a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth. Now inside the United Nations, the pressure begins to build, and Ban Ki-moon, you comatose puppet of the United States, why aren't you doing anything? And then finally, by the time the seventh UN shelter was attacked, Ban Ki-moon came under enough pressure that he called it a moral outrage and a criminal act. That was on August 3rd. Once Ban Ki-moon, namely the puppet, spoke out, it was very embarrassing to the puppeteer, namely Mr. Obama in Washington. And so finally, on the same day, on August 3rd, Obama, he's now isolated in the world, because even Ban Ki-moon is deploring Israel's targeting of civilian shelters. The US State Department called the last attack on August 3rd. They were appalled and they called it disgraceful. And after Ban Ki-moon, after the puppet turns against the puppeteer, and then the puppeteer starts denouncing Israel, on the very same day, Israel announces the ground invasion of Gaza is over. Everything happens on August 3rd. On the other hand, even after the invasion ended, the war continued for about 3 more weeks, mostly, I think, again, for political reasons of the moment, namely after the ISIS beheaded the American reporter, all the media attention shifted to ISIS, and Israel was able again to get away with massive atrocities at this point on a scale which is actually kind of amazing, even by Israel's standards. Namely, some of you will remember by last week, Israel was just targeting high-rise apartment buildings, and they were dropping to the ground. It was like a computer game. But Hamas was able to still continue firing, not rockets at the end, but mortar shells, and finally it ended with a stalemate. Neither side won, neither side achieved its political aims. Hamas wanted to discredit, Israel wanted to discredit Hamas as a terrorist organization, ended up discrediting itself as a terrorist state. They tried to break up the unity government, they weren't able to. They wanted to end US-EU negotiations with Hamas. In the end, Israel ended up negotiating with Hamas. They weren't able to stop the rockets, they weren't able to destroy the terror tunnels. The only thing that Mr. Netanyahu accomplished was he was able to satiate, to satisfy the bloodlust of Israeli society. On the Hamas side, we have to be honest about these things. Hamas's main political goal when it began the resistance, its main political goal was to lift the blockade of Gaza. This is the third time it's attempted to lift it, first in June 2008, then after Operation Pillar of Defense in November 2012. It's the third time, and they're right back where they started from. Politically, they achieved nothing. The blockade continues as we speak, and there's no real, I think, any realistic hope that the blockade of Gaza is going to be lifted anytime soon. And then that leaves the question, okay, what should be done? And I'm going to leave that for questions and answers. And then just now briefly go through the record between Egypt and Israel. There are many things they have in common. If you look at the human rights record of Egypt right now, it reads pretty much like the record on Israel and the occupied territories. After Mr. Sisi was elected, quote-unquote, elected president in Egypt, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, they issued a joint report. This was in June 2014. And they said the human rights crisis is dire as in any period in the country in modern history is now happening in Egypt. As the previous speakers have pointed out, there have been multiple massacres in Egypt, mass arrests. The figures vary. I'm not sure it's all that important to get a precise number. It's at least 20,000 Egyptians have been jailed. Arbitrary detentions, sham trials. There were 2 mass show trials in which 1,200 Egyptians were sentenced to death in just 2 trials. Massive torture, including severe beatings, being hung from doors, electric shocks to extract confessions, according to Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. Abductions to secret detention centers, and nobody's being held accountable in Egypt. The most recent Human Rights Watch report, a significant one that they did on the massacre that was mentioned earlier, namely the one in Rabat Square, Human Rights Watch wrote, "These killings most likely amount to crimes against humanity, among the most serious violations of international law. And the authorities have failed, despite the horror they inflicted, to offer even a superficial show of accountability. They have not investigated, much less prosecuted, a single police officer for what happened or provide any serious accounting. Instead, the massacre that was described to you earlier, what happened, Human Rights Watch said, instead, adding insult to injury, the government of Egypt has rewarded members of the security forces involved in the dispersals with bonuses and promotions, and erected a monument in their honor at the site of the massacre." Israel's record, as I said, is not much different than that. After Operation Cast Lead, there were 2 Israelis who were held accountable. 1,200 Israeli Palestinians were killed, about 1,200 civilians were killed of the 1,400, about 350 children. What did Israel do? Well, one Israeli was sentenced to 7 months in jail for stealing a credit card during the operation. And then a couple of years later, under a lot of international pressure, they sentenced another Israeli soldier to a few months in jail for killing 2 women who were holding a white flag. After that, there have been no prosecutions, nothing for Operation Pillar of Defense. And as Amnesty International said yesterday in its report, there's no possibility that any Israeli investigation or tribunal is going to prosecute anyone, and so it has to be done by an international organization. the Human Rights Commission or International Criminal Court. One other interesting comparison between the Palestinians and the Egyptians is the US response. The first democratic election ever in the Arab world that occurred in January 2006 when the people of Gaza elected Hamas into power. That was the first democratic election in the Arab world. How did the United States respond? Well, we know Mr. George Bush was president then, and he was very anxious to promote democracy in the Arab world. It was called back then democracy promotion. And the way he promoted democracy in the occupied territories was President Bush, together with others, in the US administration, they attempted to orchestrate a coup to overthrow the government in Gaza. They worked with Israel, not so much Israel actually, they worked more with the Palestinian Authority or elements of the Palestinian Authority to overthrow the first democratically elected government. Unfortunately for them, Hamas proved to be a more formidable foe than they expected, and they defeated the coup or preempted the coup, and then took full control over Gaza. So that's what happens when a democratically elected government that's Islamic comes to power. What happens when a democratically elected government gets overthrown? That's an interesting case, because now we can look at what happened in Egypt. What did the US do when the government was overthrown? Well, for the first year, the US kept insisting, as it does today, the US kept insisting that Egypt is on the road to democracy. It's a democratic transition. It's difficult, but it's a democratic transition. Now, it's a very strange sort of democratic transition, because most of you in this room know about governments or countries that are engaged in the struggle to democratize themselves. And let's see how this democratic transition began in Egypt. How did it begin? It began with the overthrow of a democratically elected government. That's a strange way to begin a democratic transition. Then it proceeded to the jailing of the democratically elected president. That's also a strange way to begin a democratic transition. Then step 3 was the mass slaughter of unarmed supporters of the democratically elected government. If you looked only at the facts and not at the ideological spin, the reasonable conclusion is that Egypt is not on a democratic transition. Israel is on a dictatorial transition. But the US says no, and it had what it claimed to be good news in June of this past year when Sisi won an election. We all know that elections are the hallmark of the democratic transition. The Obama administration immediately declared that, quote, it looks forward to working with Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the winner of Egypt's presidential elections. The European Union, quote, congratulates Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as the new president of Egypt and trusts that he will tackle the serious challenges faced by the country and the new government. And in fact, we have to be fair about these things. There is really grounds to celebrate that election. First of all, Sisi received 96.4% of the vote, which is just a little bit short of what the current leader of North Korea got. Now, let's try to assess this democratic election which so thrilled Mr. Obama. Let's do a little simple experiment. You'll forgive me if it sounds like I'm engaging in hyperbole, exaggeration, I'm trying to stick this very as closely to the facts as I can. As is well known, President Barack Obama, his popularity has plummeted among the American people. A majority do not approve of the job he's doing. The last poll showed about 42% of Americans currently approve of the job he's doing. And in fact, it's true that there are many among the American people who positively detest him. In other words, he was roughly in the same position as Morsi was at the end of his first year of office in Egypt. Now, more or less the same. Let's imagine if the Republican Party, capitalizing on this popular discontent, the Republican Party orchestrated an army coup to remove Obama from office. Then, the Republican Party slaughtered his unarmed supporters in a series of bloodbaths, then declared the Democratic Party a terrorist organization. Sisi declared the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, then banned the Democratic Party, jailed its leading members, then arrested the other opposition leaders and prohibited any and all public dissent. And after doing all that, which is what happened in Egypt, uncontroversially, nobody disputes that's what happened in Egypt, then after doing all that, finally, to appease international opinion, Republicans held an election. And in the election, the only other candidate was Jesse Jackson. Would anyone seriously call this a democratic election and a milestone on the road to the democratic transition? Well, leaving ideology aside and then just looking at the brute facts, during the Gaza massacre, the last one in the midst of the massacre, when it was clearly, and as I said, uncontroversially being documented that Israel was engaging in war crimes, the United States was prominently continuing to send arms and weapons to Israel. In the case of Egypt, the U.S. aid, all U.S. aid to Egypt was resumed after the election, the so-called election in June 2014. And most recently, the United States sent 10 Apache attack helicopters to Egypt. Incidentally, all of this is completely in violation of international law. It's illegal under international law to transfer weapons to a country which is a major violator of human rights, and certainly Egypt easily falls into that category. It was very interesting, and this is where I'm going to leave off, it was very interesting to see the reaction to what's now happening in Egypt along the border with Gaza. As I said, throughout the attack on Gaza during the summer, the refrain of the mantra of the Obama administration was, Israel has the right to defend itself. And during one of the, I think it was the State Department press conference, they were asked about what Sisi is doing now along the Sinai, along the border. He's destroying 900 homes. About 10 to 15,000 families are going to be displaced. Their whole livelihood is just being destroyed overnight out of nowhere. And the U.S., yes, I'm perfectly on time. The U.S. State Department was asked, what do you think of what Sisi's doing? And the response of the State Department was, well, Egypt has the right to defend itself. And that's true. Israel has the right to defend itself. Sisi has the right to defend himself. The only ones who don't have the right to defend themselves are the people living under a brutal and illegal siege and blockade. People of Egypt who are now living under a brutal dictatorship, they don't have the right to defend themselves. Only important people have the right to defend themselves, and the rest of us just have to live with it, or it's just too bad. Thank you.
And I forgot to say it earlier.